Thanks.
All right. Okay, I gotta move the pictures of you over so I can see what I'm looking at. Can I minimize to the bottom? Show active speaker. Okay. All right. So the title of the talk is a psychophysical approach. Do you see me in the speaker box? I'm sorry. I want to make sure I've got this set up right. I see
Yeah.
Jeff. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so this is called a psychophysical approach to gist-based processing in human memory. And you'll find out what that means. Probably most of you had some exposure to the idea of gists, just getting a summary about an event. And the summary is what ends up stored in memory. So I'm going to drill down into short-term memory with this. So I'll start by mentioning, as Karen said, I started off as a graduate student in Karen's lab, working with Karen on signal detection theory. And this is the signal detection model. The details, I'm not going to go into all the details of the model, but Karen and I published a number of what I think are very important papers on this. And also with Jeff Starnes, we've published a number of things on signal detection theory.
Some unimportant papers.
Yeah. And the basic idea is we did a lot of focused testing of the model against different alternative models. But the basic idea is that the decision stage, when you're making a decision about whether something you're looking at is something you've seen before, so memory decisions and as well as perceptual decisions, the decision-making part of those different kinds of tasks can be characterized as a statistical inference process. And in fact, the earliest accounts using this theory in psychology referred to the model as the statistical decision making, the statistical decision theory, SDT. And so with the radar, it was applied to radar detection and got its moniker of signal detection from that. But one of the things that is nice about tenure, I guess, is it allows you to take little bigger risks in your own research than you can take when you're struggling to establish a career. And part of that I've found is that you can think really broadly about things that maybe wasn't useful to do before. And so started thinking about this general idea of humans as statistical inference machines. And you realize pretty quickly that almost all of the successful models of memory retrieval, which this doesn't talk about the process of retrieval, but the models of retrieval generally assume that the representations people store for different items that they've encountered are stochastic, probabilistic. So they're statistical approximations to the physical stimulus. But you think about it, and then I start to think about, well, is it possible that in fact it's kind of the reverse, that the representations are not statistical approximations to the physical stimulus, but they're representations of the statistics of the stimulus, which is kind of a subtle distinction. And almost no models in long-term memory make that latter assumption, but a lot of the theories in visual short-term memory do make that assumption. And so that took me into visual short-term memory research. And the key paper here is a paper by O'Reilly in 2001. It has a lot of weaknesses in my opinion, but the basic effects have been replicated many times. And his basic vanilla task was a rapidly presented display, a 500 millisecond display of dots varying in diameter. And then that disappears and there's a test probe. And the task of the participant is, there are one of two kinds of tasks. One is a recognition memory task, which is, was this circle in the set that we showed you? And this was tested multiple different ways, including 2AFC. And people are terrible at that. The 500 milliseconds with these homogeneous stimuli, just varying in one feature, unidimensional, they really can't do this task. But if you ask them on other trials, which O'Reilly did, is this larger or smaller than the average circle? They're excellent at that. And they're excellent at that for a long time. Doesn't seem to decay. So that's really striking. And his interpretation of this, which is maybe a little extreme, but it was that people, when they're confronted with homogeneous items, which happens all the time, you know, and you're looking at your lawn or you're watching the cars when you're driving down the freeway, that you might just discard the individual representations and save the statistics. So it's the idea is it's a representation of the statistics rather than of the items that survives. Salt Chong and Ann Treisman followed this up in a series of papers. And in their first paper, they had displays of 2 displays like this, one after the other, with the circles on either side. And this is a mean comparison. So after these 2 displays flashed by, the participant had to indicate which of the 2, the first or second, had the larger average circle size. And this is a little misleading because this is one condition where they had homogeneous sizes, and they also had single items on the 2, but the key one is that they vary in size, of course. And they varied the time, the duration of the frames, which was always the same duration for each of the 2, from as low as 50 milliseconds to a second. And so the DV here in the plot is the percentage of difference in diameter that is necessary to maintain a criterial level of accuracy. So it's a threshold. And the 3 lines, the differences aren't statistically significant, but the one that has for the mean estimation with varying sizes is the diamonds and the dashed dotted line. But no matter which one you look at, you see the same pattern, which is that the difference, even though this is kind of blown up, so it looks like there's a difference, but the difference is so small from 50 milliseconds to a second. There's only a drop of about maybe 2 or 3 degrees where the threshold is elevated. In other words, they showed that at only 50 milliseconds, you're basically got all the information you will have to be able to do this task at a high level for the mean judgment. So their conclusion, remember this is Ann Treisman, so feature integration theory. Their interpretation was this is a pre-attentive extraction of the statistics. It happens in parallel, globally, prior to short-term memory. It doesn't require attention, all that good stuff that you would expect from feature integration. Now, this was, of course, generated a huge amount of attention and a huge amount of research. You saw people like George Sperling getting into this, publishing, and a huge amount of the theoretical interpretation was in line with this. It's some kind of early extraction of statistics. So it's representations of the statistics. And this is just one example. This one, Haberman and Whitney, they're always schematical. There are verbal theories. There are no real computational models of this. I'd assume that this is all happening in V1. So again, the details of this picture don't really matter. It's just an example showing that, you know, here's one reputed lab that thinks that it's extracting the information from feature detectors in V1. So that's super early visual processing. However, in 2008, Miksic and Simons took kind of an obvious step in retrospect, which was just to do an ideal observer simulation where you program a computer and you give the computer the stimuli that the subjects are seeing, and you tell the computer to randomly select a certain number of items and compute the mean. And they showed that if you only select 2 items, you get really close to real subjects' performance in the tracement tasks. You do worse if you do more, and you do worse if you only take 1, but 2 items. So they suggested that this can't be some kind of parallel extraction if you're only subsampling, as they call it, 2 items. That suggests that it's a strategic thing, that it involves working memory. And so back and forth, people arguing about, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, question. Are they assuming, but like when the item is attended to, are they assuming you know the diameter perfectly?
Yes. Yes. So these are ideal observer. There's no noise, which the way I interpret that is it's a pretty tough test. It's really, the burden of proof is really strong on the model, because there's no free parameters. There's no way to fit the noise in the data. So if you get something really close without any free parameters and you're assuming this unrealistic noiseless process, then to me, that's pretty convincing that they could be doing something like this.
Right.
We have,
But people would obviously not be perfect in their perception of the diameter. So maybe like a better thing to do would be to have like a one circle condition to figure out how much noise in people's diameter percept there is, or whatever they used here.
yes.
Have the model say how many do you have to see given this level of noise to match the, you know, the averaging performance or whatever.
Yes, I will say in the Treesman and also some work I'm going to show that we did in our lab. I'm not going to show you all of it, but in our lab and also in this paper, they had single item conditions, and they actually, I think they actually get worse over time. I think it's the squares for just a single item, but it's not statistically significant. So if you show them one item, they're pretty good at reproducing that. But if you show them a whole display of items, there's too much, you know, going back to O'Reilly, a whole display of them, any one is not going to be remembered very well. But if you, there's another paper, Marchant and de Fockert, where they did a clever queuing thing that dragged attention in space. And then they found estimates of averages were pulled toward the item that fell where they were queued. So if you can get attention to be on one item and test that particular item, which is what happens, of course, in single item, then they're pretty good. They can do that. Okay, so anyway, so there's all of this back and forth about what's going on. Is it automatic? Is it early? Or is it a working memory thing? And it's really hard to figure that out because the field was in this, you know, Wild West stage. The Wild West stage is where, you know, where you've got all kinds of people are cashing in on this. You're going to, you know, just doing experiments just to show, hey, it happens if you use crosses instead of circles, or it happens with movement, or it happens with color and hue, or it happens with spatial frequency, happens with, you know, it happens with auditory stimuli. So it's really good because it showed that the findings seem to be really pervasive, regardless of the nature of the stimulus and even the modality. But it makes it really difficult to derive a really cohesive mathematical theory because there's no systematic comparison of different theories within a particular task and then comparing across tasks. So when a memory researcher like, you know, me or Jeff or Karen were confronted with the Wild West stage of a literature, all memory researchers have coded in our DNA the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. And, you know, say what you will about this model, its lack of detail, it really has proven itself, in my opinion, to be very useful in directing the progression of research to answer questions about what's really going on, to systematize and direct research in a structured, organized way. So we figured, well, let's start with this. And if well, this really is an automatic early extraction of statistical information, then that implies the iconic store. They should be extracting this right out of the iconic system. So this is the Atkinson-Shiffrin, the memory, the visual parts of the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. So iconic memory, for those of you that are less familiar with iconic memory, it's got two main subcomponents. It has a visible persistence component and an informational persistence component. And the visible persistence is something that's been known about all the way back to Wundt. It's distinct from after images, and it is an actual imagistic representation where people feel as if they still see the stimulus for a very, very short period of time. And you can only really get at this indirectly by estimates of, you know, press a button when the stimulus disappears, and then correct for motor lags. You know, there are all these different methods for how to get at this. And it's pretty well established this is one component. And there's a task, a temporal integration, that measures this, or seems to measure this fairly reliably, which I'll tell you more about later. The other newer component, relatively speaking, is informational persistence. And that's what George Sperling was measuring with the whole and partial report tasks. So for example, informational persistence would be if you flashed a bunch of letters on the screen, as Sperling did, the first thing people forget, as Jones and Newhart and others have shown, is the locations. And so a participant could end up quickly and rapidly forgetting the location of a letter or even the font it was in, but they'll still know they saw an L somewhere, for example. So that's a high level categorical linguistic kind of representation. It's informational. And I could go into the literature about why we know these are dissociable and why they are, it's pretty well agreed in the iconic memory literature. These are the two subcomponents. So if we're going to test whether extraction of averages, let's say, which is what I'm focusing on here, involves iconic memory, then the first thing to do is see, does it involve visible or informational persistence? So this is the first paper, this one, all the papers I'm showing you are like in their third R&R. So you should probably, so I'm assuming what we've done is legit and you'll probably see these in the literature soon. But here's the first one. We were looking at a task used in David Melcher's lab, who's a co-author here, in Woods et al. And this is called a temporal integration and segregation task. And this goes all the way back to Dololo's research in the 60s and 70s. And it's supposed to tap into visible persistence, and there's good reason to believe that. The idea is you have two displays presented rapidly with a blank in between. And if you overlay these two displays, you get what's on the top, and you can ignore the colored circles. These are just for expository. They would see a display that's missing an element here. So on an integration trial, the participant has to click on the screen after the displays go by. They get a probe screen, they have to click where the missing element was. So in order to be able to do that, they have to be able to combine those two displays together. The other task is the opposite, segregation. You have to segregate or discriminate between the two frames, and the response there is click on the location where there was a split element. The element was split across the two frames. So if you integrate, it's going to hurt you because you'll just see one element. And so the key variable in comparing performance on these is the duration of the interval between the displays, the ISI. And what you get with that over and over again is a crossover where you get worse with ISI on integration and better with ISI on segregation. So that makes sense. So that's the basic idea. And all that we did is we added one thing on top, which you can guess what it is. We asked people on some blocks of trials to give us the average orientation of the elements. And of course, to do that, you don't want to have both of these ends have openings in them, or you have ambiguous, a vertical and a horizontal. There's no average. So we gave it a vector. So we closed one of the ends. So now you have vectors, basically. So here's our version of it. So in A, that's the time course. We built a custom PC. I shouldn't say I built it. My wife actually built it. My wife is a computer scientist, so she helped us. And we built this machine where we have a 250 hertz frame rate. And we verified that and benchmarked it with independent software. And we can get down to 4 milliseconds a frame. So we used 8 milliseconds for frame 1, 8 milliseconds for frame 2, and then varied the IFI or interframe interval between 30 and 86 milliseconds and 8 millisecond steps. And then they get a probe response screen. So there are numbers where they can click on the quadrants to locate like a missing or split element, depending on whether it's segregation or integration task. And there's a little probe element in the middle that on the averaging trials, we use the method of reproduction. So they turn that stimulus using the mouse until it matches their memory for the average of the stimuli pooled over both frames. So that's the averaging task. So it's going to require both frames. So then these are just showing the tasks. The colors are not, they don't see these colors. It's just a highlight. Like the green ones are this frame, the purple ones are this frame. If you overlay them, this is what you'll see. So there's the split element. Integration, there's sort of the missing one would be. Orientation averaging, you just be trying to average, turn this probe to match the average orientation. So any questions on that basic task? That's the basic task we used. Okay, so here are the predictions.
Chad, sorry, I had to hit my unmute. So are each of the frames, they're all pointing the same orientation? That's what it looks like here.
No, this figure is a little misleading. They weren't all, I'm,
Actually, I was looking at the orientation task where they
oh, this
appear
one?
to be, yeah,
Yeah, no, that's not, they varied in their orientation.
okay,
Jacob had a reason for this. I think it was just expository. He's making it easier to see how you overlay them, but the task
yeah.
wasn't like that. Yeah,
Task was harder, is what you're saying.
the task was harder. Yeah.
Okay,
I,
thanks.
no, in fact, I think that was the issue. I think this was the practice. This is what they saw in the practice trials. Yeah, that's what that was. Okay. Um, so here are the predictions. So if the averaging performance relies on visible persistence, then we should see as temporal integration performance changes, which is the same as saying as the segregation performance changes, we should see changes in the precision of their estimates, because remember they're using method of reproduction. On the other hand, if we don't find a dependence, so like they're equally accurate, even though integration performance is varying, then it suggests they're using informational quantities to do this. And that would solve one problem. It would tell us what kind of persistence they're using, but it opens up a new question, because if information is the quantity, then STM is a possibility, because STM is an informationally limited store. So those are the predictions. And so first here's just the integration segregation data. We're trying to replicate the basic Melcher lab finding. And we get the same, the crossover isn't in the middle, which we have some ideas about why that is, but it could just be a bias which would affect the intercepts. But we do replicate, the most important thing here is we do replicate that integration will decrease with the IFI and segregation performance will increase. So these things are varying. And so now the question is, does the precision of their reproductions of the mean orientation vary with these? And these are the data, group data. The individuals are consistent with this. So I'm just showing you the group data as a function of the inner frame interval. And we fit these with the von Mises distribution just to get, circular estimates of variability and things like that. But no matter which way you analyze the data, you find that the spread of the error distributions does not vary as a function of the IFI. So they're averaging performance. And if you compare this to random performance, which you just generate a random error distribution, they're significantly different from that, whether you do a Bayesian test or frequentist. So there's no change. So in other words, they're good at this, averaging, and there's no change with the interval between the two frames. So that means we're dealing with an informational quantity, not a visible persistence, but informational. And that means even though we answered one question, we now have a new question, which, okay, we're back to square one, really. Is this iconic memory or is it short-term memory? So luckily we're kind of thinking we might end up here. So we included a manipulation of the variance of the orientations within each frame, the intra-frame variance. And this allows us to test that subsampling idea. So we are going to do ideal observer models subsampling the data. The idea is if participants are subsampling 2 or 3 items, they're going to get higher and higher error as the variance within each frame increases, because on average, a sample is likely to be further and further from the mean. So that's the logic of that. And then we tested that by comparing the data plotted as a function of this variance in the stimuli. And we looked at their performance, and then we simulated that with an ideal observer model, no noise, 0 free parameters, varying only the number of stimuli that are sampled by the model. And these are the results. So the x-axis in all the plots is the intra-frame variance. It's a circular variance. And the dots are the data. The black dots are frame 2. So as the frame 2 variance increases, and the white circles are as the frame 1 variance increases. And you can see, looking at these data, I'm not sure where to put this screen. Maybe I'll put it right there. You can see from these data that 2 items is good. So this is 1 item model. This is 2 items, 3 items, 4 items. And this is random. The top row is random sampling from the 2 frames, and the bottom row is sampling only from frame 2. And we did only from frame 1, all the models were terrible. We did more than 4 items, all the models are terrible. So these are really the key results where you see that if you just randomly sample 2 items, just like in Mixik and Simons, you get performance that's pretty close to the data. And these 2 are basically tied, random versus the second frame. However, there's reason to side with this model, frame 2 model, because if we break the data down further, we see support for the shape of this dashed line. And this is what I'll show you. This is a lot, it's a lot going on because we broke it down by all the variables. So there's the IFI, a different line for each IFI. You don't need to look at every single line in here. The important thing is that this pattern that it predicts for frame 1, we see that for frame 2, sorry, we see that. And the questionable one is frame 1. But if you look at that, you see that it's all due to one condition where there was a very high level of error at the very shortest IFI and low error at the lowest IFI. So that's giving the slight U shape. And if you take that out, you're going to get this line right here. So we think we have decent evidence that it's from frame 2, but overall it's pretty clear that that subjects could be doing this with only 2 items. So that's one piece of evidence that this is short-term memory and not iconic memory. There's another piece of evidence which comes from the literature. So if you look at the old papers on information theory, there are lots of publications that tried to get what's the bit rate between iconic and short-term memory, and the estimates are usually around 15 bits a second. So if you do a little bit of arithmetic with this, the mean duration of an entire trial in our experiment was 76 milliseconds from start to finish, from onset of the first frame to offset of the second frame. And if you just do the math, you end up with, there must have been about 2 items. So that's, again, more evidence that they are working with the non-selective readout, as back in Coriel called it, from iconic memory. So what they end up with in visual short-term memory, when they're averaging, they're operating on the contents of short-term memory. That's what this is suggesting. So any questions? That's the first experiment. Any questions about that?
I had one question.
Yeah.
So couldn't it be possible that a representation is being formed pre-attentively, but it's being modulated by attention through some feedback loops? So yeah, it could be both iconic and so my master's project was on statistical summary representations, and when I was looking at the literature, like we did see this like 2 effects. Like some studies showed that it was modulated by attention, and some studies showed that there wasn't any effect of attention. So yeah, I was just wondering about this. Like, could it just be that it's forming pre-attentively and it'll explain all that data, but through some feedback connections and through some iterative manner, like it's getting modified again, that representation?
It's a great question. And obviously, these conclusions are not, written in stone or anything. It's what we think is going on. But, we know it's tricky because we know if you cue attention in advance, that they'll pick out a location and then they might end up just encoding a couple of items. So if you have attention focused in advance of the display, then even if they're getting this from iconic memory, it could end up being primarily the items that fell within the focus, or they could be getting higher weight if it's a weighting process that's going on. We did, at one point, Jacob Zepp, who's the grad student that did this study, he did some simulations going like location by location for each individual subject, and didn't find any evidence that any location was prioritized over any other. So we don't think that's what's going on, but of course, if this was like Sperling task, he showed in his famous paper that if you have a tone onset with the array, they'll read off the array very accurately. So there could be anticipatory attentional focus or selection happening even in iconic, but So it can't completely rule that. It's a really good point. But we think the bulk of the evidence we have is consistent with this being a short-term memory thing.
Dad, can I ask a question before you go on?
Yes.
So if the data are largely consistent with 2 from the second display, how does that rule out iconic persistence? Couldn't it be that there's iconic persistence from the second display and you grab 2 of them?
Okay. So that's a good point. So we were thinking of it as informational persistence is something that's going to vary when you have to pool across the 2 frames. It's something that's going to vary with the timing between the 2. And so if that varies and this doesn't, then it's not that. But could be that they're prioritizing the second display and they're using whatever is persisting from the second display. That's
right.
a good. One thing I can say is we have the probe doubles as a pattern mask, and that usually disrupts persistence. So we did have that, but I can't conclusively rule that out either, but I don't think that's what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right, so at this point, that sort of points us in the direction of VSTM, visual short-term memory. So if we've established, or we think we've established that this is operating on short-term memory contents, then the question arises about exactly how are they doing this? Is this some kind of strategic thing? Is there a mechanism that does this? And so one way to start to get at that is to ask about how the items are combined. What's the weighting? So if you're looking at your lawn, for example, you take a look at your lawn. If I take this away, you still have an idea what the lawn looks like, but obviously you're not processing and remembering every blade of grass. There will be some things that are close by that you might remember, or like you might remember my patch of dead grass right there, or you might remember I've got some weeds right here. You got the Gibsonian texture gradient there, so you're going to get more detail up here. So there's a weighting that's going to be applied. And even worse, if I have some categorically different thing that's really makes it really salient, like before I crop the photo and my shadow is here, you're going to remember that. So what this says is, if you go back and you just look at the expression from how to find the expected value of a probability density, you're multiplying each value of the variable by the probability that the density is predicting, and you're integrating that all together. If you have an unweighted arithmetic average, so everything is given the same weights, then this P of X will just be the probability density, the shape of a Gaussian curve, for example, if this is a Gaussian normal distribution. But if you have a weighted average, there's 2 ways to think about this. The weighted average means that you are actually placing more weight on certain observations, even if they're not the most frequently occurring observations. So this would decompose into a weight and a P of X, so P prime of X. Or you could think of it as just a single probability distribution with a weird shape. So there's like peaks over certain items that are favored, even though it's not, where you would expect it to be. So our question is, what are the weights that people are applying when they're estimating averages? So this is a study in AP&P with my grad student. He just got his PhD, Ke Tong, and Bob Sekuler, who I worked with, did my postdoc with at Brandeis. So we did a whole bunch of experiments, and the basic setup was the same. We had unidimensional stimuli, so they vary in only one feature dimension. And we had line lengths, Gabor vertical spatial frequencies, brightness, all different kinds of stimuli, but all unidimensional. And the basic task is a rolling average task. They get a stimulus for a second, stimulus goes away, they get an adjustable probe, they adjust it to match the average of all the stimuli they've seen up to that point. Of course, the first trial, they're only going to estimate the stimulus, but every other trial, they're getting the mean. And there's predictions. So if you sample all of the stimulus values from one distribution, then it's impossible, just by looking at their estimates, to tell the difference between an equally weighted average, which is the dotted line, and a recency weighted average, which is the solid line, and the stimulus is, this is all simulated, the stimulus is the light gray line. You can't tell the difference. But if you shift the distribution from which the stimulus feature values are drawn, halfway through, these pull apart. So then you see that an equally weighted model is giving you this dashed line. The stimulus, if you're only just using the most recent stimulus, is this line. So those are the two extremes, and a recency weighted average falls in the middle. So then the question is, well, what do participants do in the experiment if you do this simple experiment and they do what you would expect from recency weighting? So there's an equally weighted average, there's the stimulus, and there's the subject's estimate. And this is one subject, and three conditions that don't matter a whole lot: a small shift, large shift, and then one with big stimulus variance. And you see the same pattern. There's some anomalies, like what's going on the left, they're overestimating, but these things don't show up in other participants. What does show up again and again is what you see with this estimate falling between the two extremes. And we did some modeling. We recovered weights, and they showed a recency. You're putting more weight on the most recent stimulus, but there's a lot of weight assigned to the second and third stimulus back.
So, Chad,
Yeah.
can you also look at the trial-to-trial variability of their estimates? I mean, if they were truly taking an unweighted average, you should get to the point where they're giving you essentially the same estimate every single trial, regardless of what stimulus they get.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I think Ke might have looked at this. I don't recall, but I don't remember seeing anything like that. Most of the data, they don't, if you just look at the raw data like this, they don't show like they're suddenly getting less variable at the end. Sometimes they're, really off on the first trial or something. So if they are, it would have to be converging more quickly than you'd expect. So, but I'll go back and take a look. I don't think so, but I'll go back and take.
So just the fact that they keep sort of moving around from trial to trial also suggests that at the least it's a recency weighted average.
Yeah, that's about consistent with my impression of the data. We also did, so thank you, Jeff. We also did a version where we had simultaneous. So these lines, so this is one of the line length experiments, real simple, unidimensional. And they're arrayed left to right, and then they get the probe. And looked at that and compared that to, another condition where we had a sequence of lines and then a probe to get the average of the sequence. So that was to see if doing the judgment after every single line, right, in this experiment did something to the data. And we get the same results. So that was reassuring. And in the spatial, what's interesting, of course, this isn't sequential, so you're not going to get recency weighting, but you do get what looks like fixation weighting, central weighting. And not everybody shows this, but the participants that don't, they tend to show the endpoints. So it really suggests that I think 500 milliseconds or something. So it does suggest that it's wherever they were fixating. So that's consistent with weighting the items based on how the fidelity of the memory representation. Because if you're fixating something, you're probably going to have better memory for that than something you weren't even really looking at. If you look on the right for the sequential data, so this one is in the 2019 paper, you see that for the we had 5 line sequences and 10 line sequences, they show the same pattern with the high weights on the recency, and it drops off according to a nonlinear, I think he had a power function in one model. And he had a model, recency model, and predicted these data. These are actual predictions. The model was, he was fitting other data in other experiments, and just based on those parameter values, he just put what the predictions would be in here. And that model does really well. So they're recency weighting. And as a general interpretation, it seems like probably what they're doing is assigning more weight to representations that are more crisp, higher fidelity representations in short-term memory. So this kind of assumes like a resources plus slots model. For any of you who have ever heard of that before, you don't really need to know about that, but that's kind of where this idea of fidelity of a representation comes from. I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. Also, we have another paper that's in the final stages of the review process. And in that paper, we had also sequences with an estimate at the end of the sequence, and varied the number of items in the sequence at one experiment had 3 levels, and the other was the same idea, but more levels. And if you compare you look at the correlation between what the subject's estimate of the mean is and the actual mean of the stimuli, and plot that against the number of stimuli that were in the sequence, you see this. And why is this interesting? I don't want to get too worked up about this, but notice there seems to be an inflection point at 4 or 5 items, which memory people know this is Cowan's number. The current state of the art of the capacity limitation for unidimensional stimuli in short-term memory. So again, this suggests that there's it's working based on short-term memory contents, not, and the fact, if you even, by the way, if you just look at the timings in these tasks, you're not going to have an iconic memory. You're not going to be extracting from iconic memory in this task, especially in a sequential task. To even do that, the interval between stimuli is way too long to be doing everything from one iconic representation. So we think but what's going on with the leveling off? I don't know. That could be a long-term memory contribution. It's not clear, but I guess you only get so bad at this. So it could be interesting to know. One possibility is if you have fixed number of slots in short-term memory and then a fixed amount of resources, that here is where you're starting to fill up all the slots. Once the slots are filled up, you're spreading out an already thinned out resource. So you get diminishing returns in how quickly you're going to drop. So this is just food for thought, but I think it's consistent more or less with the story so far. So to sum up what I've got at this point, hopefully I'm not going too long. I got to check the time. 12 how long does it to 1:15 or 1 o'clock or?
You're good. Yeah, if we end around 1 and have time for questions, that'll be perfect.
Yeah, okay. I don't have a whole lot more actually, so it should be on time. But so far, here's the sort of the interim. So means are calculated late using short-term memory contents. The estimates of means that people make are weighted, not arithmetic averages. And by the way, if you know the categorization literature, there's one of the most famous debates in cognitive psychology is prototype versus exemplar models. If you go back and you look at the papers that compared the exemplar model to the prototype model in computational form, they always assume an arithmetic average for the prototype. So if it's actually a weighted average, which by the way, the tasks are very similar to these categorization tasks, it's actually a weighted average. You might have to go back and look at that again. So, but anyway, they're a weighted, not arithmetic average. The weights are probably the same as if they're assigned based on how crisp the representation is, the fidelity of the short-term memory representations. And so from all of this, it's probably a good idea to abandon the idea that this is averaging. It's kind of misleading to even call this averaging. It's more like a fidelity-based integration process. So I talked about this with the student who primarily worked on all this, Ke Tong, and we were talking about this fidelity idea, what this suggests. He reviewed the literature, he went away for a while, and then boom, he comes back with a model. And the model basically, without going into too much detail, it just assumes that your memory representations of these stimuli are distributions of potential or activation over a feature axis. So like the length of the line, there's like a peak, one of the lines will be peaked at, whatever the length was, for all the different lengths. And they'll differ in their spread. So some representations are narrower than others. That means the memory representation is stronger. And the basic idea is that when you make a response in these mean estimation tasks, you're sampling from the distributions, and the number of samples you take is a function of the fidelity of the representation. So you'll sample more information from a strongly remembered item than from a weaker item, but you never completely shut off the influence of the non-target items when you're sampling. And so he adds on to this kind of like a sampling distribution, like a central limit kind of thing, and then he gets the mean estimation data. So without going into tons and tons of detail, I just want to tell you, he's got this sampling model and it explained everything I've shown you so far in simulations. And it also explained all the key findings in the literature in simulation. So that was his dissertation, which, I wish he was here, he could tell you about his dissertation. But I just want to what I want to tell you about this model is the predictions it made that we were not thinking of in advance. We were trying to describe old data. Okay, but the big test is predictions. And there were some surprising predictions about areas that you would think have nothing to do with any of this. So you can apply his model to single item estimation. So it's basically recall. short-term memory recall. So you present some items or an item, and then you give a probe, and they have to adjust it to match the item that they've just seen. So I show you a line, the line disappears. Here's a probe, make it as long as the one that you just saw. And so again, the model's assuming it's actually simpler than the mean estimation model by one tiny amount, which is there's no averaging of samples. So, you know, you've got for a given representation, a given distribution I, you're taking samples, you make a vector for that. And you infer through kernel density estimation, there's an inference of the distribution from those samples. And that's going to be determined by the mean of the stimulus and the fidelity. And so the fidelity, that's going to be a function of all the key variables you would think of, like the amount of time, how much noise was in the stimulus, you know, whatever is active in the study, you could plug in. And here's one of the two crucial things. So even if you don't, you know, want to remember any of this, the two crucial things, one of them, the number of samples you take from a given memory representation, J, so the length of this vector, is a function of how narrow that distribution is, how strong the representation is, determines how many samples you take. And the second crucial thing is that you then pool samples that could come from all the representations to different degrees. So even though you're being asked about one item from the memories, from a memory set, from stimuli that are being held in memory, recall one of them, you still are going to get an influence from other items. And you infer a density from that and you sample a response. So that's basically, you know, so here's an example fidelity function. You know, nonlinear, it's going to be monotonically increasing upper bound, you know, basic constraints on the kinds of functions you can pick. And so as the standard deviation of your memory representation increases, the number of samples you pull from it decreases correspondingly. You create the kernel estimate of the resulting pooled distribution, you sample for the response, and then maybe this is where the actual target would have been on whatever the feature dimension was. Okay, that's the base. Yeah.
Sorry, Chad. What's a sample in this context?
Sample would just be you've got some amount of evidence that well, I think you know, I think it if it say it was orientation, I think it was like 45 degrees, but it might have been if you know slightly might 43. You know, so you're giving some amounts. The sampling would be you could think of it as in the model it's the number of random draws you take from that distribution over what you think it was. And
gotcha. So I have some uncertainty about everything you showed me. You know, there's some array of orientations on the screen. I have some uncertainty about everything you showed me represented by a distribution, right? This one, probably 45, but I'm not exactly sure. And I'm going to sample from those distributions and put them all together to get my summary, and the ones that I'm more certain I can see the orientation, right, where that's a peaked distribution of uncertainty, I take more samples from those. And the ones where I just have no freaking clue what the orientation is, I take fewer samples from.
That's it.
Okay.
Chad, can I ask a maybe silly question?
Yes.
How do you know what the standard deviation of representation is unless you sample from it?
Yeah, you don't, I mean, right now, we didn't do any experiments. Maybe we did, but I don't think we did experiments to estimate what it should be. We did have like single item, and you use that as a baseline in some earlier studies. So single item estimates, and you get, so if you're doing reproduction, you get distributions, error distributions out. So you can get an idea for a given type of stimulus and a given set of experimental parameters, what the spread of the error distribution would be across different trials, and then use that as like a baseline, you know, so it should be in the ballpark if you've got, you know, one item to sample.
I can see how you do that in the modeling, but I'm asking about a cognitive process. Is how would I know that this is a broad distribution unless I'm taking a bunch of samples from it?
Yeah, so we don't, so one thing I should mention is this is in its early stages. I mean, we have one paper, you know, it's going to be probably out pretty soon with this model, and a dissertation, but there's a lot of room for development, but we don't have a lot of the details about how much does the person actually know. We don't have a lot of that coded in. But you can imagine one way to do it might be the same sort of thing that you would do with kernel density estimation, because you can, or the way you're sampling a posterior in Bayesian stats, is that you know something about how far the samples you are taking are from one another. So if you take one sample randomly from one distribution and you take another sample and it's really close to that, then you should probably take another sample. If you take two samples and they're really far apart and you take another and it's really far apart, then you could stop. You know, so there, you could code this in. We didn't do that, but it's not, I don't think it's a logical trap in the model.
Gotcha.
Could,
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. Okay, so here's the thing I'm really excited about here. He was just taking this model to simulate old data where you're doing item estimation tasks and fitting those mean estimation tasks, and found by surprise that, lo and behold, if you plot the model's estimations of the stimulus value against the target value, you find an implicit central tendency effect. And this is a very old effect that's been known about since practically Wundt's lab. It's in Woodworth and Schlossberg's book. Nobody never knew what was causing it. And it's if you have a stimulus that's below the mean of all the stimuli you've seen so far, you tend to overestimate the stimulus. And if it's above, you underestimate. So it's like a shrinkage toward the mean of the stimuli. And the model explains that, it turns out, because the stimuli have a fixed range. You don't have infinite numbers of stimuli. So if you have a target that's at one end of the range, and you're also sampling from non-target distributions in memory, you're more likely to have an influence that pulls you toward the center than away from the center. So that's what's producing that in the model. And so that explains what's going on. So then we thought, well, could we push this even further? So we started thinking about sequential dependencies, which is something I've been thinking about all the way back to working in Karen's lab as a grad student. So you got central tendency bias and sequential dependencies. And it seemed to me like this sounds a lot like what Ke's model is doing, where you're sampling mostly from the stimulus you should, but the one just before is kind of strong too, so that might bleed into the representation. And that's called a representational leakage hypothesis of sequential dependencies. And sequential dependency, I didn't really define that. That's just the finding that your estimate of a stimulus on a given trial tends to be pulled toward the estimate on the prior trial. That's called a response assimilation. These are some data from Dave Whitney's lab that show this. And it's analyzed a few different ways. Here's one that shows like the error on the current trial as in orientation reproduction relative to the orientation on the previous trial. So if the orientation is low, then you'll have a negative error, you'll get pulled toward it. And if it's high, you'll be pulled upwards. And it's also looked at like in the memory literature a lot. It's used like a regression analysis, and you find that the trial, stimulus one trial back and two trials back carries some weight in predicting the response. And so there are really two explanations for this. One is criterion shifting, and the other is representational leakage. And usually when the criterion shift model, which is a signal detection model, again, details are not that important for this talk, but usually when this is tested out, they're not using recall tasks, but recognition yes/no tasks. So you can't get these kinds of data. And so it's hard to know how a criterion shift could give you recall distortions, but a representational leakage could do it. So we were thinking maybe Ke's model could explain this. And this thing on the left we already mentioned is implicit bias. People are already taking this in the ensemble coding, perceptual averaging, that whole literature. They're already interpreting this as evidence for automatic extraction of the averages, that whole theory I've been talking about, because it's happening even when people are not supposed to do it, and it's not good for them to do it because it gives them errors, So we wanted to see if we could explain all three of these just with that one model. And so here's just a few models, control models, ideal observer, you're going to have no central tendency bias. For sequential dependencies, there will be no weight on prior trials, and your errors in reproduction will be unrelated to the prior trial. And if you change the lag, so instead of error against one trial back, you go to two trials back or three trials back, that's not going to change. The slope of the lines won't change. So another model, it's a prototype model, arithmetic average, gives you the central tendency bias, but for sequential dependencies, it gives you equal small weight to everything else other than the target. So this model is Hutton-Locker's lab, Duffy and Hutton-Locker, comes out of the categorization literature, says that you respond to the target, but there's some influence from prior items, and it's the prototype of the prior items that's influencing you. So it's like a weighted average between the prototype and the current item. So there's no, so it doesn't, just gives you a flat set of weights. And it gives you the error in sequential dependencies, that the error is pulled toward the previous item, but it doesn't give you a lag effect. That's because the weights are the same on all the items. Only in the FIM, the fidelity-based integration model, does it predict central tendency bias, the regression weights that show sequential dependencies, errors that show the sequential dependencies, and it makes this novel prediction about the slope of the line, that's going to go down with the lag going down, which is kind of intuitive that should happen, but these models don't predict it. There were several other models we looked at. We looked at subsampling models, all kinds of models, and they were all terrible. So I'm just telling you about these just so you can see. We did compare this to other models. And the only model that makes all four of these predictions is the fidelity model. And the data are exactly what you'd expect from the fidelity model. So this is for reproduction of Gabor's spatial frequency, but we also got it with line lengths and with brightness. They all show all four patterns, that there's a central tendency bias, there's sequential dependencies that show up in the weights on prior trials from regression analysis. There's sequential dependencies if you look at the error data, the errors are pulled toward the prior items. And it predicts that the slope of those blue lines will go down as you conditionalize on trials further and further back. So in other words, we've basically managed to give a unifying explanation of both implicit central tendency bias and sequential dependencies in this literature, which were previously discussed completely separately. And I've never seen any paper try to relate those two things together. And it adds to our story that averaging is something that's happening in short-term memory, because we can show that this is not necessarily like an implicit automatic effect of memory for statistics. It's just a range effect that happens. So just with that one model setup, you get all these out. So conclusions, the explicit and implicit central tendency effects, they all are due to one single fidelity-based integration process that's acting to combine samples from both target and non-target item representations that are held in short-term memory. The representations we think of as distributions over a feature axis, consistent with a lot of the current working memory models. And so we can say that what the representation likely is a statistical approximation to the physical stimulus, just like the long-term memory people have been thinking. It's not a representation of the statistics, as the VSTM literature has been trying to say. And secondly, the fidelity-based integration account has an advantage that it explains seemingly unrelated effects with that same mechanism, sequential dependencies being one of them and the mean bias being the other. And so in short-term memory, as in life in general, we tend to give stronger evidence more weights. However, we are never completely free from the influence of our prior experiences, and we tend to rely on those prior experiences more when we are uncertain about the evidence we're confronted with. And so it does appear to me that this could be a fairly general principle that we've just found has manifested itself in these literatures. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you, Chad. Big round of emoji applause for Chad. So we can start off with graduate student questions. Any students have questions for Chad? So Patrick, if you're willing, I don't know if you can form this into a question, but how is Chad's analysis of sequential effects in this model? Does that map on to your modeling? Or it seems like, is this like one of the components that you've been modeling with sequential effects? Or?
Yeah. Hi, Chad. I don't know that we've met. I'm the Patrick Jeff was talking about. Yeah, nice to meet you. I'm a recently graduated, and my dissertation was on serial dependencies and sequential effects in particular. Yeah, and so we were looking at, I'm going to talk for a second, trying to formulate a question, as Jeff asked, or to answer, I guess, Jeff's question. We were looking at what happens if there are, so we weren't looking, I wasn't looking at explaining the source of dependencies per se. I was more looking at what happens if there are multiple dependencies caused by some other processes, who knows what they are. Maybe it's neural adaptation, maybe it's some kind of averaging effect. But given that there are a few dependencies, what kinds of effects would we expect trial by trial as the sort of the result of these dependencies? And still don't have a question, but I think answering what Jeff says, I think this, yeah, I mean, this really fits as far as it seems like a really nice, clean explanation for why you would rely on evidence from the past, and so why your current judgment would be pulled towards the past. Although there might be other factors at play too, like adaptation might temper that a little bit. But
if I can jump in, Patrick. I mean, so yeah. Patrick convincingly found that on the sequential dependency effects, there's both a push and a pull simultaneously to the prior event, but the push is towards perception, but the pull is towards response. And so I think that's consistent with what you're finding. If you think about that, you know, the response you gave is the thing that's more likely to live in some kind of short-term memory. So I think there's some compatibility here, and you guys should talk to each other.
Yeah. Well, I will say, thinking back to the sequential, I actually did my comp, Karen will remember, I did one of my comps questions on sequential dependencies. And one of the things you find, although they weren't all perception papers, but well, actually most of them were auditory, I think. But what you tend to find in those tasks is if you give people feedback, then the dependency is dependent on the response. But if you don't have feedback, which we didn't, then it tends to be dependent on the stimulus. But in general, unless the task is really impossible, then the stimulus and response are going to be highly correlated in these kinds of tasks. And so, you know, in our data, it'd be very hard to tell the difference. I don't know if we could, you know, really tell the difference in our data.
Patrick,
yeah,
that's the technique.
I assume with no feedback.
Right. Well, I was actually going to say, yeah, we had a similar intuition for our studies, but through some, I guess mostly relying on hierarchical modeling, we were able to come to some we were able to be a little bit more precise than I think we would have guessed. So even though the responses were pretty closely correlated with the stimulus, you know, people aren't responding randomly. There are times, yeah, we were surprised. I was a little bit surprised, but there were times in which there were still sort of distinguishable effects, given sort of enough hierarchies and enough averaging over the subjects.
Yeah, I mean, it should be pretty easy you just swap that out in our model. It'll probably won't make any difference, but it doesn't mean that would be, it would still be meaningful. And it really, I think, is what it actually opens up a door on some of the questions we usually kind of suppress in experimental psychology. Like we want to assume that all the trials are independent from each other. Well, you know, that's not true. We want to, you know, try to distinguish between stimuli and responses. Well, we know can't always do that. And then there's also, I was talking to Bob Sekuler not too long ago, and we realized in our data we had another project we were working on that people that take longer to respond are having more sampling of the probe. You know, that could be happening. So reaction time is thought to be an indicator of, you know, the accumulation of evidence from memory. But if you're just repeatedly sampling from the probe because you're sitting there staring at the probe for a long time, that's going to interact with the sampling process from memory because you're encoding and updating a memory of the probe. And that doesn't, you know, so there are all these interesting, to me interesting, but I think the problem is, you know, if you're trying to get a grant or something, people would not find that interesting. It's potentially really important, you know, because if you want to really understand what's going on in the system, you have to start thinking about the effects of the experiment itself. It's almost like quantum physics or something.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, I think like Dave summarized, I don't know, the things that I was thinking about are totally compatible. Yeah, so thanks for sharing. Thanks for sharing this fidelity.
If you have a manuscript that's shareable, please send it along. I'd be really interested to talk to you some more.
Yeah, yeah, I'll do that. Thanks.
Okay,
Any
so
other?
people can be logging up if they need to. Oh, and I see a message coming in from Karen as I say that. But if Chad is willing, we can do more questions as well.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, so I came across this model, distributed attention model of perceptual averaging. I was just wondering, like, if you looked at that. So they did something. It wasn't actually similar. So they encoded precision using a zoom lens model. So they tested different models of attention.
Is this Bach and Chong? Is this
Yeah,
Salt?
yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
know
yeah,
that. Yeah, I know this work.
yeah.
I was talking to Kyle about this work not too long ago.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sorry. Keep going.
No, so yeah, I was just wondering because I think they arrive at the same conclusion that they were just encoding precision using a zoom lens model. Yeah. So I just wanted to know your thoughts about that model.
Yeah, I thought so. I won't go into all detail, but that paper came to my attention, and I was really impressed because most people in this literature don't do any mathematical modeling. You know, they'll make inferences about V1 and stuff, but they never have a actual predictions that they're, you know. So I was really impressed that they basically took Lewin Doscher's external internal noise ideas and some of the ideas from Sperling and did a mathematical model using that Barbara Doscher, Lewin Doscher engine. They used an engineering diagram, you know, and engineering ideas, electrical engineering, and they did this. So they used that model, but the problem with it is it doesn't answer any. It doesn't have any memory systems in it. There's no clear delineation between memory systems, and so without clear delineation without specifying a memory system, how are you going to tell where it's coming from? And if you can't tell where it's coming from, it's hard to say that it's pre-attentive or that it's attentional spread without, you know. So it's missing crucial detail to be able to really answer those questions. That was my opinion of it. Also, that idea is coming from Treisman and Gormican, which is this weird, it's really an influential paper, but it's very strange because it's like, so you read Anne Treisman's work and she's always talking about pre-attentive means early, automatic, not necessarily requiring attention, etc. And then this one paper comes out where they found that you could serially search by groups of items. And so to explain that, they said, oh, well, we never really meant no attention, we meant distributed attention. And then 2 years later, a bunch of single authored Treisman papers came out where she kept saying pre-attentive means no attention again. So it's like, this is why you need a mathematical model, because the verbal stuff, it just all over. So it was nice that they did that, but they didn't have enough detail to really answer the questions that you got to answer to know if that's what's really going on. That's my opinion, but I thought it was really nice work.
So Chad, will you go back to your information theory slide?
Oh, okay.
Because I didn't really fully get that.
That is, where did I put that?
The two bits, 2 items.
Yeah, I know which one you mean. I just forget where predictions. Oh yeah, it was after, right here.
You just passed it, I
Let me
think.
move.
Yeah, there you go. You're on it.
It's right here. I can't see it. I don't know if you can see what I'm sharing my screen. So I have like your pictures are like on top of. Sorry, I don't use Zoom a lot. But okay, yeah.
So you're saying these people have found 15 bits per second can get into short-term memory.
From iconic memory.
And then you're calculating out, okay, how many bits is that?
And this would be for non-selective readout. So you're assuming there's no attentional cueing in advance or something, like it's just random what gets read out.
Gotcha. Right, so you're taking your stimulus time. Right. So is the 1.14 just how many bits should get through in your stimulus time?
Yeah.
In your
Yeah.
7
If it's
seconds?
15 to 1 and you just solve for x, you get 1.14.
Gotcha. Okay, and then
So then you need to know how many items would result in. So actually, you don't really even need to do any calculation at all, because if it's a log base 2 and you have 1, then it's got to be 2, right? Because you're to
Right.
undo the log, you're raising it, and the base is 2 because it's a base 2. So you got 2 to the 1 is 2, you know. So it's 1.14, so it's slightly more than 2. But and the 2 would be the number of items. If you have, I'm using the definition of information theory in psychology, which is really the same, I think, as in Weaver, Shannon and Weaver, and in the Shannon paper, which is it's what you would need to be able to make a correct choice between one of 2 alternatives. That would be 1 bit. So 2 items, 1 bit. That was in George Miller used
that's
that.
okay. That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Because, you know, like if it's the orientation judgment, processing that orientation is much, much more than 1 bit of information, right? You're going from no knowledge of the orientation at all to knowing the orientation. If you want to make it fully continuous, it's infinite bits of information, but I'm sure, you know, it would break down at some point. So it does seem tricky to me to decide how many bits is every item that you get to see.
Yeah, so I'm using
Like a forced choice kind of thing. I went, if you gave me these 2 orientations, I went from having no clue which it was to knowing that it was this one, and that's my 1 bit.
Yeah. So if I were starting from our data to derive a bit rate, that would not be doable for the reasons you've outlined. But this isn't using our data to derive the bit rate. The bit rate comes from studies that use the 2AFC to figure out what the transfer would have to be. So those studies are not doing it the way that you would have to be doing it for this problem to be a problem. I don't know if that makes sense. So they got the stat, you know, and then we just solved for, well, how many items would we end up with, assuming this stat holds roughly for our participants. And there's good reason to think it would, or there's no reason to think it wouldn't, because the stimuli are some of them are identical to what was used in these old papers, you know, line lengths and things like that they're using in Miller and these old papers. So unidimensional, if you can chunk them, well, that's different, but you're not gonna really chunk line lengths unless they're organized into an image or something, and you're not gonna, and you only have 1 dimension, so you don't get the advantage of multidimensional that Miller showed, where you get higher level information, hierarchical, you know, structures from multiple dimensions. So that's one of the advantages of using unidimensional stimuli, but it's also a disadvantage because that's the first thing a critic will throw at you as well. You know, the real world is got all these different dimensions to it, so you're going to have to expand this out pretty soon.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about entropy for a while to see how many people dropped off the call, and it looks like about 9. So I think I predicted that pretty good. Any other questions from anyone? Okay, well, thank you, Chad. That was very interesting.
Thank you for having me.
See an alumnus thriving out there in the world. And for those of you still on, it's going to be Christian Broadbeck next week. So I'll see you guys then.
See ya.
Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.
So you got a kid on the, oh, Chad's gone.
Chad's gone.
I was talking to Chad. He's gone.
See you later.
Okay.
Bye.